at that point I knew that I was going to have to start to understand more about what it was to be Chinese. I mean, I didn't understand what the heck that was going to be at the time, but I knew something was wrong.
Welcome to It's About Time. I'm Sadia Zaman. When people who experience racism truly begin to believe all the negative stereotypes about their own culture, race, and faith, the racism goes inside. Today you'll meet a young man who is struggling to accept himself and his Chinese-Canadian heritage after he internalized the racism he once experienced. Stephen Lee was born in Vancouver. He spent the first few years of his life in Richmond and Midway. Stephen's father worked as a logger and a cook. Eventually, the family bought a restaurant and settled in Osuis, a small town in southern British Columbia. The Lees were the only Chinese-Canadian family in town. And while some people welcomed them, many didn't.
I remember being at the restaurant, coming home, and occasionally, it seemed like when we first moved there, like about once every week, it seemed like my dad was in a fight with some trucker or something, or some fellow anyhow, and I don't know, I guess they decided they wouldn't want to pay for the dinner or something, and I don't know, I guess it was fortunate. My dad was a pretty tough guy. I mean, he wasn't that big, but it seemed like I don't remember him losing a fight anyways, and maybe he got some respect because of that. I would meet kids, and things would be okay, at least immediately anyways, but then things would happen like the next day. When I would see the kid again, they would call me names and try to get into fights with me, which was totally confusing to me. I couldn't understand why that was happening. So that caused me a lot of stress and just a lot of confusion. And I remember just not being very happy at that point.
Stephen coped by creating his own world, one where he felt accepted. He dreamt of imaginary kingdoms in faraway places.
Basically, I retreated into myself a lot. I remember that I daydreamed a lot. Quite often in class, I would just be caught staring out the window, I guess thinking of myself being somewhere else in some sort of far-off land where this type of thing didn't happen, where I was accepted for who I was, and basically just lived in, I guess, my own sort of internal world. Fortunately, I mean, I had my sisters, and so we, got along, and then occasionally my family would make trips out of town, and, we'd see we'd occasionally see other family members. But I just remember withdrawing a lot.
Stephen had trouble concentrating in school and spent a lot of time alone. And after school, he often went straight home and washed dishes in the restaurant. Everywhere, he got the message that there was no pride in being Chinese.
Any sort of positive representations of Chinese people were pretty rare. Inevitably in the media, on TV, in movies, I mean, they would be relegated to sort of character roles, and not very attractive character roles either. I mean, quite often it seemed like the image you'd see would be of the little Chinese nerdy-looking guy with thick glasses and big buck teeth, and not a very flattering representation at all.
Home was the one place Stephen saw other Chinese Canadians. But he didn't learn much about his culture or heritage. Stephen's parents wanted their children to speak English, to fit in.
they were so concerned about the racism that they had faced, and not having us go through the same sort of thing, that that they really avoided teaching us a lot of that stuff and wanted us to focus on just integrating. And in fact, you know, we even stopped. We didn't study the language even, so the kids basically lost the language. So it was just basically their experiences were so horrendously awful in terms of the racism. They just felt that the best thing for us would just be to not learn all that stuff, and you know, if we wanted to perhaps later in life do that, then we could choose to do so. We occasionally went up to Vancouver to visit, like I said, relatives, and you know, occasionally pop into Chinatown, and you know, we see other Chinese people at that point. I don't know, but it all seemed kind of foreign to me, probably about as foreign as it did to any other kid growing up in Asuyas. You know, so I mean, so we, you know, we really just didn't learn about that aspect of ourselves, about our culture at all.
When Stephen went to university in Vancouver, things didn't change much. He still knew very little about his heritage, and he still felt uncomfortable with other Chinese Canadians. He found himself surrounded by white friends.
I was quite often the only Chinese person in my literature and philosophy courses, and I don't know, I guess that led me to think, I mean, how many people were streamed or conditioned or, you know, by the society and by their teachers not to do, not to go into those areas because Chinese people just weren't supposed to, and instead were encouraged to go along the science or math or accounting path.
To counteract all those stereotypes, Stephen adopted a tough image. He rebelled against all the expectations that Chinese students are shy and quiet. It didn't work. The
stereotypes in people's minds were so pervasive that it didn't matter if I could speak perfect English or not. I mean, as soon as they'd see me, they would assume that that I couldn't speak except with a very thick accent, and it's like the lens was just so fogged that it didn't matter what the reality was. You know, they would see what they wanted to see.
That became obvious to Stephen the day he had a long talk with a woman at the university.
So she asked me what I did, and I told her that I was a philosophy student, and I was doing a minor in English literature. And anyway, so we got into a discussion about various things in philosophy, and I don't know, I think we even discussed like Goethe and Kant. And anyways, I think we went on for a good 20 minutes. Somebody else caught her attention, and I guess an old friend of hers or something, and they talked for a few minutes, and then she came back to me a few minutes later and said to me, well, so how do you enjoy math? And at that point, I just didn't know what to say. I just left. I didn't know whether I was more confused or angry, and you know, it was just a case of, I mean, knowing that this person did not see me and saw my color and all the things that, all the notions that were attached to that, and that was really disheartening.
Stephen realized that in rebelling against all the stereotypes, he had gone too far the other way.
Much of my later youth and my early 20s were spent, it seemed to be, to try to prove that I could be as white as anyone, that that in terms of the things that they said that Chinese were, or whatever the stereotypes were, it seemed like I was spent so much of my energies rebelling against those things, and to the extent that, you know, I was losing sight of what I perhaps really wanted and what my essential self was. And I think that those are the same struggles that a lot of people, a lot of visible minorities go through. I mean, wanting to fit in, and so they try real hard to prove that, that they're no different than everybody else. And there's a real cost to that, you know.
He discovered one of those costs the day he went to Chinatown by himself. He felt awkward, out of place.
I remember my taking transit, and my first experience was I'm actually getting on a bus and going to Chinatown, and then just noticing that a strange feeling when I was on a bus full of Chinese people, and sort of looking at them and just feeling really strangely out of place. And at that point, I knew that I was going to have to start to understand more about what it was to be Chinese. I mean, I didn't understand what the heck that was going to be at the time, but I knew something was wrong.
So Stephen started to read, to learn about what it really means to be Chinese Canadian. He read about the long history of Chinese Canadians in Canada. He thought about his grandfather, who had paid a head tax to live here. And he began to understand some things about himself. The first thing Stephen learned about himself was that he wasn't immune to the same kind of racism he had experienced as a child. In fact, it had become such a part of him that he began to see other Chinese Canadians the way white people saw him.
I wasn't immune to all the stereotypes and the socialization and the whole bit, and also I guess this sort of immigrant sort of sentiment as well that seems to suggest that you know, all those traditions and everything were backwards.
I guess everyone knows each other except I guess Ruby, you met.
I've met everyone.
Stephen started to spend time with other Chinese Canadians. 3 years ago, he joined the Chinese Canadian National Council, the first Chinese organization he had ever been a part of.
At first I was somewhat reluctant to get involved in a group that seemed so ethnically centered because, I don't know, this sort of sense that it's like asking for something for me. It just seemed like the type of thing that was happening rather than just a sort of wider concern with society in general. But when I actually met the people that were involved, I realized that there was a real value to actually working within this group. There being frustrations for sure, and there's a lot of politics involved, which sometimes isn't very attractive to deal with. But on the whole, I feel like there's some real forward movement in all of this. The issue really comes around the lobbying.
So I don't know why we're barking up the same tree. It just doesn't seem to be a strategy that works, and whether we need to be doing public education. And that in the past, refugee claimants and successful refugees didn't have to pay the application fee for permanent status.
Today's meeting addresses many of the issues Stephen cares about. The involvement has given him a sense of community, a sense of belonging.
Sai means to wash, and tall means to iron. It doesn't have to work close.
Now Stephen is also learning Cantonese.
A realization that language itself has a lot of values, and that you can't really understand someone unless you can sort of see through their eyes, and that means understanding the language. Sure do wish my parents had taught. I mean, I understand the reasons why they didn't, but I do wish that they had taught me when I was younger, and that, you know, lived in a society where they didn't feel that it was necessary to protect us by not teaching us the language.
Next door neighbors.
Stephen is also examining his values in other areas of his life, like his personal relationships.
To be attractive, you had to be white, blonde, tall, and just people who don't fit that stereotype just didn't look right. Didn't think about the possibility of dating somebody who wasn't Caucasian. It just seemed foreign to me, as it did to anybody else who was raised in that kind of situation. And I mean, in a way, it wasn't. It didn't seem so terrible because clearly, since I was so westernized, that it was unlikely that I was going to be able to connect with anybody who was very traditional. And then I think a lot of the Chinese women who were westernized like I was felt the same kind of pressures and had a tendency to date Caucasian guys. So, you know, so I don't know. At the time, I really didn't feel that bad about it, but I guess over time, I realized there was something wrong with this as well.
Stephen finally dated a Chinese-Canadian woman for the first time, and it felt comfortable. Stephen has also decided it's important to have a spiritual dimension in his life.
Being able to sort of connect with yourself physically and just sort of moving away from that pure alienation that we feel as our sort of minds just floating around, disconnected from the rest of the universe.
Switch.
And there is a real sort of spiritual sense that you get when you are in touch with your body.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Some days, Stephen thinks about other children who grew up with him, the other ones that were also teased.
There was a girl that was partially black. For some odd reason, the other kids are picking on her, and like I said, there were incidents that took place, and like I said, I didn't do anything. I didn't take part in it, but I'd witnessed some of it, and I guess there were a few cases where I could have actually done something to stop them. I mean, it never took...
Stephen wrote letters to some of those children.
That if I really care about these people, I mean, then I should try to focus on trying to lead a life that, you know, with integrity and follow the values that I believe in, and not just kick myself. And so basically I just wrote letters apologizing for the things that had happened, and had hope that at some point we could get together and discuss these things.
No one responded to Stephen's letters, but it doesn't matter. He needed to write them. Today, Stephen is trying to live in a way that doesn't place Western values higher than Eastern ones. It's been one of the biggest commitments he's made in the search for his roots.
The Western analytic, future-oriented view isn't enough. That we need to look at our roots. Those cultures and traditions hold important truths about who we are as people, and we shuffle those things off at our own peril. The things that I've had to deal with aren't just restricted to my particular situation of somebody being raised in a isolated community where we were the only minority family. I think that these are the same issues that people face, whether even if they're living downtown in Toronto in the midst of the Chinese community or the black community or whatever, because we still get the same sort of messages from society and from the media of what the ideal is, and just that you should see those battles that you have to deal with as a way to develop yourself or as a source of potential strength.
At work or at home, if you've ever had to count quantity